This video will be a review of the Niner RLT9 Steel. And I've owned this bike for a few months now, and I've ridden it from fast group rides to long solo dirt rides to even some single track. And I started out actually with the aluminum RLT, and I switched to the steel. And I did a video that compared those two. I won't do a whole lot of comparison in this video, although I may mention the aluminum a couple times. But I'll focus just on this bike. Now, Niner offers this in a frame set, and they offer various build levels. This is the Ultegra 4-star build. I'll talk about the 4-star build, but I'll also structure this video so that it's helpful for you no matter which option you're looking to go with, whether it's a complete bike in various build levels or just the frame set. So let's get started. All right, let's look at the frame first. And let me just mention that this is a 53. I am 5'8½", and this bike fits me very well. I usually ride a medium in a bike, or I usually ride a 54 centimeter road bike. This bike being a 53 is a really good size. The next size up, 56, was too big for me, but I'm glad I went with this size. And it's got a 90 millimeter stem, which is about right for my proportions. So looking at this, you can see that it has a through axle both front and in the rear. So it's a 142 by 12 and kind of a standard 15 QR in the front, which is really nice. The fork on these are really stiff. This is a carbon fork, and the fork is actually more stiff makes the bike more stiff in the front than in the back. And so that's something that, you know, it's not a real noticeable difference, but when I'm going down a rocky dirt road on a downhill, so going pretty fast, I can feel the rear end swim around a little bit. And I'll talk more about the ride quality here in a few minutes, but since I'm talking about the fork, I just wanted to kind of mention how stiff it is. And it does have areas on the fork where you can mount front panniers or front fenders. It comes with these little rubber plugs, and one of my only gripes with this bike is that these plugs fall out really easily, and I noticed that on my aluminum as well. It's not a big deal, but it does leave these holes kind of exposed. I did actually call Niner about that, and they didn't really have any to send me. They said you can put a little screw or something in there, but whatever, not that big of a deal. Now this bike uses external cable routing, which I really like. It makes the bike really easy to build, really easy to swap cables out. They're external all the way down. The only thing that you would run internal on this bike would be electronic shifting, and it's got these little ports here, so you could run the Di2 wire in here and then through the frame, and obviously you'd have to have the crankset out to do that. But if you're going to run mechanical shifters, which is what I have on this bike, and again, we'll talk about the 4-star build here in a few minutes, but it is mechanical shifters with hydraulic brakes. But everything's external. It does come with the chain guard here, so that's really nice. It's a Velcro, and yes, this is the first bike that I've used without my rubber homemade chainstay protector. This one is a really nice one from Niner, so that is of course included. If you do buy this as a frame set, you will get the frame and fork, and you get the bearings, and you of course get all the components of the bearings, the top cap and everything, and you get the spacers with it. And of course you do get the axles when you order this as a frame set. Also with the frame set, you do get an adapter, so you can run a 28.6 front derailleur or a 31.8. This one is a 31.8, I believe. And so I was able to mount it on this bike. And by the way, all the components were on the RLT9 aluminum. They're both the 4-star build, so it's the exact same components. Now up at the headset, like I said, it does come with the headset bearings. It's 1.5 inch at the bottom, so it's a tapered headset, and a 1 1/8 at the top. Some people have commented how fat this looks. It's just because it's a standard tapered with smaller steel tubes, so you don't have a hydroformed aluminum or some kind of funky carbon shape with really fat down tube and fat top tube. So it does make the head tube look a little fat at the bottom, maybe a little bit disproportional. I don't think it's a big deal. I actually think it looks kind of cool, but some people have mentioned they think it looks not so cool, but I disagree. I like the way it looks, but it does make for a really modern, modern bike in terms of the headset bearings being a tapered fork, so not a big deal. Tire clearance on this bike is excellent. Now, these tires are a 40C tire. These are the Maxxis Rambler. This is the only thing on the bike that's not stock. And again, I'll go through all the components with the 4-star, but this is a pretty fat tire. This tire, to me, it doesn't seem quite a 40C. It measures more like a 38. I don't have a gauge to do it. I just use a tape measure. But you can see you still have plenty of tire clearance on this bike. And Niner says you can fit up to a 1.75 inch mountain bike tire on this, so that's pretty cool. And in the front, you've actually got even a little bit more tire clearance than you do in the back. So you can put some pretty good tires on this, which is really nice. I think 40C is about as big as I'd want to go, but you could go a little bit bigger. And by the way, you can put 29er tires on these rims. So whatever 700C wheel you have, you could put a mountain bike tire, so you can go up to 1.75 inches. And various brands are a little bit thinner, a little bit fatter, so that might vary a little bit. Both Niner RLTs, the aluminum and the steel, are disc brake only. So there are no bosses for cantilever brakes, which is fine, because I think you should build this bike with disc brakes no matter what, because whether they're mechanical or hydraulic disc, they're just so much better. You don't have to worry about your rim, rubbing or anything like that. I won't really go into disc brakes, but cool that you don't have these bosses sticking out for cantilever brakes. You can go up to 160 millimeter rotor on the front and the back. These do have 160s, by the way. You could go 140, but for a gravel grinder, I think 160 is the right way to go. Now, I mentioned the external routing. It does come with these plastic clips to hold the cables against the frame, and it does use kind of a little boss here for the rear brake, but for the shifter cables you would use these little plastic retainers, and there's 3 of them. And so again, this is a really easy bike to build. It does use a threaded bottom bracket, so it comes with the adapter. So you would press in the adapter and then you thread in the bottom bracket. And so you could use different types of bottom brackets. So I think you can use Niner's eccentric bottom bracket if you wanted to set this up as a single speed. Some people may want to do that. But for me, this is obviously a geared bike, so I used the threaded insert adapter. This bike does use a 27.2 millimeter seat post, by the way. And you get 3 water bottle mounts with the steel. With the aluminum, you only get 2, but you get the normal ones inside the triangle, and then you get the one on the down tube. So I don't have one here right now. I may, in the summertime, put one on because I live in an area that gets very hot, and I go through about a water bottle every 45 minutes. And so I probably will mount one on there in the summer. But this bike is obviously really good for touring. You do have also mounts. I mentioned the ones in the front, but you've got the rear mounts for a rack and panniers. So you've got your bolt under here. So this bike is really versatile. I'll talk about the versatility of this bike here in a few minutes when I talk about the ride quality and my experience with it. But it's an extremely versatile bike. Whether it's bike packing or gravel grinding, maybe even some cyclocross racing. It's not the best cyclocross race bike, which I'll talk about here in a minute, but it definitely could be a cyclocross race bike if you're not racing at a really high level. Now let me talk about the 4-star build kit, which I feel is a really good value versus performance. I think it's one of the best kits that they offer. Starting off with the Stan's wheels. I really like Stan's wheels. If you go to the 2- and 3-star builds, you do not get Stan's wheels. You get Niner's house brand wheels. I run everything tubeless now. I will never use tubes again, and I will never use tires that are not tubeless ready. And by the way, while I'm mentioning tires, these do come with a Schwalbe G1 tire. That's an excellent tire. It says a 700 by 35C, but I actually measured that one to about a 37, maybe even a 38. So it's a pretty plush tire. It's got really tight space knobs. And so that is standard with the 4-star build. And it's also a tire that I'll probably put back on here from time to time, or I may even put it on my cyclocross race bike for the off season when I'm using that on dirt roads. So a really good tire. That tire aired up perfectly. This bike doesn't even come with tubes. So it comes with the Stans rims, and it comes with the Schwalbe G1 tires, and those things aired up very nicely. I put Stans fluid inside, but you know, really good spec on the wheels and the tires. So it is mainly an Ultegra build. The only thing that's not Ultegra is the cassette and the chain, but the shifters are Ultegra, and these are mechanical shifters with hydraulic disc brakes. A great combination, especially for bike touring when you don't want to worry about a Di2 battery going bad or running out of charge. Although those things do last forever. I did have one go bad on me one time, and so it's nice to have mechanical shifting sometimes when you don't want to have to worry about charging or battery or anything like that. The one thing I really love about the mechanical shifters and hydraulic brakes is the lever action. On Di2, I've mentioned this in some of my other videos, I won't go too much into it, but on the Di2 with hydraulic disc brakes, the lever comes really close to the bar before it grabs. It's not a big deal, you get used to it unless you have two bikes like this and you're going back and forth. And when I get on my Di2 bike, that lever comes really in, and it's kind of disconcerting the first few minutes I ride it because I get used to this. So really good action, super precise shifting on the Ultegra mechanical shifters. Shimano has their mechanical dialed in, and so you of course get the Ultegra crank, and this is a 46-36 crank, and an Ultegra front derailleur, Ultegra rear derailleur. The cassette is an 1132, so a pretty decent gear range with the 36-46 front. If you're riding in some really steep terrain, you may want to get a cassette that's got a little bit bigger, large cassette in the back, so maybe a 35. But for what I use this bike for, the gearing's totally fine. Really good for dirt roads. Cockpit on this bike is really solid. It's got a composite seat post. It's not the RDO seat post, which I kind of wish this bike came with. The RDO has some flex to it, a little bit more flex than this one has, so it's a little bit more compliant when you're riding rough roads. But the saddle on this bike is excellent. I love this saddle. It's got the anatomical cutout, so you have the little space there for your equipment. But it's a really comfortable saddle, which is obviously very important for long dirt road rides. I mentioned the stem is a 90. This is, Niner's house brand stem, alloy bars, but they're comfortable. So it's just a really good solid cockpit. And the last thing that I'll mention before we start talking about the ride quality is this, of course, is a Reynolds 853 steel, very high-end steel. What you want to look for if you're looking for a steel bike, and so it really helps the ride quality. So now let's get into that. Okay, so let's discuss now the ride quality of the bike and the uses of this bike, because in one way I feel like this is a very unique bike, but on the other sense I think it's a very versatile bike that's going to cater to a lot of riders. So I had mentioned that I originally had the aluminum, and the reason I got the steel is because I already have a carbon cyclocross bike. The aluminum was a little bit too stiff for me. In other words, if I wanted a stiff bike, I could ride my cyclocross bike on dirt roads, even though the geometry of this bike is a little more slack. But when I got on the steel bike, I immediately knew I made the right decision because of how comfortable the bike feels on rough roads. So let's talk about the geometry of this bike. So it's a little bit slacker than a typical cyclocross bike, and it's got a longer wheelbase and longer chainstays. And the numbers, if you look on paper, the head angle is only like maybe half a degree more slack than the Niner BSB9 and other cyclocross race bikes. The chainstays, they're longer, but they're not like a lot longer. The wheelbase isn't like huge, but all those numbers cause the bike to really handle differently. I mean, you definitely notice a difference when you get on this bike. And the reason is because on a gravel grinder, you don't want to have a bike that requires a lot of attention to keep the bike going in a straight line. The slacker geometry allows the steering to not be as twitchy to your steering inputs, which really helps for two reasons. One is the fact that this is designed to go long distances. So whether you're bike packing or whether you're just doing a long gravel ride, your distances are going to be pretty long. So you need that geometry to be a little bit slacker, because when you get really far into the ride and you start to get tired, you want to not have to worry about the handling of the bike so much. The other way the slack geometry helps is the fact that this bike is probably designed to go on faster terrain than a cyclocross race bike. And what I mean by that is, a cyclocross race, you may hit 25 miles an hour in a cyclocross race because the turns come so rapidly, and they're sharp turns, you're on grass, you're just not hitting really high speeds. This bike, when you're going slower, the handling feels a little wonky. It feels just like the bike flops around a little bit at slow speed. So it is harder to get this bike around a corner compared to a really steep angle bike like of course a cyclocross race bike. But when you're going faster, that's when the slacker geometry really comes into play. If you're going 40 miles an hour down a mountain on a dirt road with loose gravel, to be on a cyclocross race bike, it's going to be a little sketchy. And so a gravel grinder with the slacker geometry with this bike, the RLT9, it's just going to be a lot more stable. So slacker geometries really come into effect at higher speeds. I mean, it's just like a mountain bike. When you're on a downhill mountain bike, if you're in a parking lot riding around, the bike's going to feel terrible. The steering is just going to just flop all over the place. You're going to be like, this bike handles horribly. But when you get a downhill mountain bike going at 30 miles an hour over rocky trails, it's going to handle great. Same thing with a gravel grinder. At cruising speeds, 25 miles an hour, it's going to handle really well. At 40 miles an hour, it's going to handle a lot better than a cyclocross race bike. So that's enough for talking about the geometry. Now let's talk about the ride quality of the steel. Now, I'd said when I got back on the aluminum, this bike felt awesome because this bike is super comfortable on dirt roads. I probably don't use this bike to its full potential. I don't do 150-mile gravel rides. My gravel rides might hit 80 miles, maybe 100 during an event. But even still, I love the comfort of this bike. And with the larger tires, at least 35C tires, now with these 40C tires, the bike is very comfortable. It is more comfortable than a carbon bike. The difference between aluminum and carbon is more noticeable to me than the difference between the carbon and the steel, the Reynolds 853 steel, because carbon bikes can be built in different ways. They can be built to be pretty compliant. But this bike, the steel tubes just allow enough vibration absorption and compliance to make this bike really comfortable on rough dirt roads. So steel is more comfortable. The downsides to a steel bike are twofold for me. One is it's a little bit heavier. So this bike is about 4 pounds heavier than my cyclocross race bike. The other downside is the fact that the tubes may flex a little bit under really high loads. So if you're cranking real hard, it's not going to be as snappy and responsive as a carbon bike or even the aluminum RLT. That bike doesn't flex very much at all, so the power transfer is a little bit more direct on that bike. But this bike, you know, for bike packing, this bike's awesome. I mean, you've got all the braze-ons for panniers and fenders, but it's so comfortable. And if you're bike packing an extra 3 or 4 pounds when you're carrying 40 pounds worth of gear, it's not going to matter. But this is not a race bike for me. And I had mentioned that I did some fast group rides on this bike. And that is probably one of the only times riding this bike that I wish I was on my cyclocross race bike, because there were attacks. There were guys putting in just these massive efforts, and you know, I'm having to put out 400, 500 watts to bridge up and cover attacks. And I felt like I was struggling on this bike. I didn't feel like I was riding quite as strong as I did on my cyclocross race bike. But it still, you know, it held its own. It's just a little bit of flex in the frame and the extra weight of the steel made the bike just not quite as responsive. But you've got to, when you get on a bike like this, that's, again, slacker geometry, steel, you've just got to kind of convince yourself that the bike's not going to be as fast. It's not going to be as snappy and responsive. And once you settle into that, this bike, it just rides really well for what it's intended to do. I did mention also that I took it on some single track, and you know, it did pretty well. And I do like those Maxxis Rambler tires better than the Schwalbe G1s for single track, because they just have more grip, more knobs. The knobs on the G1s are really tightly spaced, and I just don't have a lot of confidence on single track on those. But the bike did pretty good on single track. It's nowhere near as comfortable and fast as a mountain bike. Do not get a gravel grinder if you're mainly going to be riding single track. Get a mountain bike. It's still a rough ride if there's roots and rocks. My trails, there's some sections that are smooth, but there's a lot of roots, and it beats you up a little bit. But you know, it can do it. And so, you know, if you have rides where you're on pavement and dirt, single track kind of mixed all in, it's fun. This bike is so versatile. Now, even though this bike looks like a cyclocross race bike, it would not be my first choice for cyclocross racing for 2 reasons. One, the geometry, the other is the weight. So in a cyclocross race, you're doing a lot of rapid succession turns at slower speeds, and the geometry is not going to allow you to get through those quickly enough. Also the weight, you know, if you're sprinting or mainly carrying the bike. So in a cyclocross race, you're getting out the bike, carrying it over barriers, upstairs. That extra 4 pounds is going to play into it. So it wouldn't be my first choice for cyclocross racing. Can it do a cyclocross race? Absolutely. It's a comfortable bike. It's going to allow you to do the race and not be quite as fatigued if you're on a really stiff bike. But if you're really focusing on cyclocross racing, the Niner BSB9 RDO would be the way to go. And that still is a versatile bike. I mean, that can go on dirt roads and roads, and of course cyclocross racing. If you're kind of doing a mix, so you really love gravel grinders and you don't want a bike that's really steep and twitchy, but you do want to do a good amount of cyclocross racing, the aluminum RLT9 would be the way to go. So to wrap this up, I really applaud Niner for making a steel bike. There's not a lot of companies out there to make a steel bike, but it's not for everyone. If you're a major weight weenie, you probably don't want a steel bike. But if you like a bike that's very comfortable and you don't want to spend a lot of money on a titanium bike or a really high-end carbon bike, and a steel bike is the way to go. Now, the frame set, $1,500, not the cheapest steel frame set you're going to find, but considering that you get the headset, you get the rear and front axle, you get a carbon fork with a carbon steer tube, it's a good bike, good frame set, and of course Niner offers all of the different build kits. I like the 4-star. I like the Stans wheels, and I like Shimano hydraulic disc brakes, and that's what you have to go with. You have to go the 4-star to get those. The beauty of the RLT9 Steel to me is the versatility and the comfort. If you want a bike for a single track that's very smooth, RLT9 Steel. If you want a bike for commuting and you want to put racks and panniers and fenders, RLT9 Steel. If you want a bike for long gravel rides, even if you're not backpacking, even if you're like me and you just want a second bike for training on the dirt roads, the RLT9 Steel is a fabulous option. If you want a bike that can do cyclocross racing, it's not your focus, but you want a bike that's also very comfortable and versatile to ride around town, it's a great bike for that as well. So a really versatile bike, a bike that's going to last a very long time. It's pretty future-proof with the front and rear through axle, the tapered fork. You've just got a lot of things that you can do with this bike. So that's going to wrap it up for my review of the Niner RLT9 Steel. As always, if this video was helpful for you, please give it a thumbs up for me. And any questions or comments that you have on it, leave below and I'll try to answer them. Thanks for watching.